Hello and good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is around a study we undertook earlier this year on IoT, and we'll be presenting its key study findings. I'm Iqbal Bedi and I'll be your host and presenter for today. We've got a packed agenda. We will be going through this at some pace. We'll be joined by Minister Stewart, who is the Deputy Secretary of State for Scotland. And after that, we'll be running through the research report findings. So we've structured the report findings in 3 sections. So I'll be appearing across the course of today. And in between that, we'll be hearing from Dr. Stephen Milne of CENSIS, Allan, who is the CEO of RTIoT, and Alasdair Rettie of North. The agenda is to the right, so we're just kicking off with the welcomes and introductions. And just by means of introducing what we're going to be talking about today. So this report was commissioned early in the year. The problem we want to try and understand was, why is IoT, or how is it being understood within local authorities? What are the challenges to deploying IoT? And what lessons can be learned from those organisations and local authorities that have deployed IoT. So we'll be taking you through this journey all the way through, and I hopefully will take you through in terms of what does IoT mean, and along with the speakers, what are the benefits, how do you make a business case for IoT, and then towards the end, what's the role of technology? Should it be technology-led or neutral? And as I say, at the end, we'll kind of end with session on how do you incorporate IoT into your smart cities and smart places ambitions and outcomes. So stay with the webinar right to the end. That's when I think you will truly benefit, is in the last final phase when it all comes together. Now just some housekeeping. Do ask questions. We've shown a highlight here of what the question panel looks like on the webinar platform. So if you go to the bottom, if you type your questions there, then they'll ping up on my screen, and then we can ask the presenters questions as we go along. The idea is to have a panel session or a presentation session, and that can be followed by a very quick Q&A. If we cannot get through all your questions, we've got another session right at the end. I'll jump back to the agenda here right at the very end, 3:30. Then we'll do a final Q&A session. So hopefully we'll get through all your questions today. So please do keep it interactive and ask as many questions as you can. The slides, I think we are going to make available subject to speaker approval. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the event. And as I say, please do stay to the end. And if you're not speaking, please do go on mute as we go through the webinar. So next thing is for me to introduce Minister Stewart, who I believe is from Hamilton. And you've got a keen interest in technology, and Minister Stewart is the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in Scotland. So over to you, Iain.
Thank you very much, Iqbal, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to take part in this webinar today. Just to give you a little bit of my own background first, before I joined the government, one of the roles I had was to head up the all-party parliamentary group on smart cities, which gave me a real insight into many of the opportunities that this provides in shaping and delivering the key public services, as well as the more immediate and visible benefits of efficiencies in transportation and energy efficiency. So I've long had an interest in these matters, and I should also point out that the constituency I represent in Milton Keynes is both historically connected with this sphere, with the work that Allan Turing and his colleagues did decades ago, and we are also experimenting with lots of different models and schemes to take forward this agenda. So as well as my official government role I've had a long personal interest in this subject. What I'd like to do today is just spend a few minutes talking about what the UK government's doing to increase and improve internet connectivity, which is obviously underpins all the work that you're doing, and also to look at what we're doing to protect consumers once they are connected to the internet. So on the first point, obviously over the last 18 months, the importance of digital connectivity has really been brought home to us, and it's an interesting question. Had the pandemic happened before we had Zoom meetings, WebEx, all the different platforms, how would we have coped as a society and an economy? And that's when you have had problems in connectivity, that very much becomes apparent and a problem. So there's not many positives coming from the pandemic, but the importance of good connectivity and the benefits that can flow from that is one of them. And what I hope to demonstrate over the next few minutes is the government's commitment to improving that. We expect that the necessary infrastructure investment digitally will mostly be built using private investment, with the telecoms industry delivering 80% coverage by 2025. But through our project Gigabit, which we launched in April, the government's investing £5 billion to deliver gigabit capable broadband to the 20% of properties not reached by the commercial market, and those are typically in rural areas. Properties in central Scotland were actually the first in the UK to benefit from upgrades realised through the Project Gigabit funding. And right now the coverage is around 54%, with very buoyant competition in towns and cities. We're also working closely with the Scottish Government to increase gigabit coverage in Scotland by extending coverage where possible through the existing R100 contracts, and we're investing £33.5 million into that. And we very much will continue to collaborate with the Scottish Government to develop the next phase of gigabit activity in Scotland, with the potential to deliver alongside R100 a number of new gigabit contracts at local and regional level. We also continue to work with several local authorities in Scotland to provide gigabit connectivity to over 530 Scottish public sector buildings under our local full fibre networks and rural gigabit connectivity programmes. These are sites located across the Scottish mainlands and islands, and are future-proofing vital services such as GP surgeries and hospitals, schools, libraries, leisure and community centres. Another important aspect of connectivity concerns mobile coverage, and we are aware that there's a perennial problem in certain parts of Scotland. Last year we agreed a £1 billion deal with the main mobile network operators to deliver the shared rural network, which will see the operators collectively increase mobile phone coverage throughout the UK to 95% by the end of the programme. There will be improvements in all 4 nations thanks to the world-leading programme, but I'm glad to say that the biggest improvements will be seen in the devolved nations, particularly in Scotland. In Scotland, coverage from all 4 operators will rise to a minimum of 74%, up from 44%. And coverage from at least one operator will increase from 81% to 91% by the end of the programme. The 4 mobile network operators have already commenced work on the first element of the shared rural network programme, which is funded by the industry, and we're on track to eliminate the majority of partial not spots where there is coverage from at least one, but not all the operators by mid-2024. By the end of this year, coverage upgrades in many partial not spot areas will have been delivered, with work to improve coverage in other areas in progress. This includes 124 new sites to improve coverage in rural areas, including the Orkney Isles, Cairngorms and the Borders, and a further 132 upgraded sites throughout Scotland. The government has big tech ambitions, and we deeply value the social and economic benefits that greater connectivity and connectedness can bring. But although we've got big technological progress and increasing uptake, I think it's fair to say we're only scratching the surface of the advantages that connected products can offer consumers and businesses, as well as the wider economy and the delivery of public services. And I know this will be a key aspect of what you're discussing today, and I'll be really interested to see some of the discussion and conclusions that you reach. But of course, coming with all this development, there's an important focus that has to be on the safety aspect, and we have to be able to assure consumers that the devices being brought into their homes are secure, and the advancement and greater connectivity cannot be at the expense of consumer security. So the League UK Government Department, DCMS, in conjunction with the National Cyber Security Centre, have put the UK at the forefront of establishing cybersecurity standards for consumer connected products. In 2018, we published the Code of Practice for Consumer Internet of the Things Security, and following this last year, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute published the first ever globally applicable standard for consumer connected device cybersecurity. This standard builds on the principles established in the UK's Code of Practice, as well as feedback from industry, governments and NGO members from 95 countries. And this has been adopted or endorsed by governments as far afield as Singapore, Finland, India, Australia, Germany and Vietnam. And in the Queen's speech in May this year, which set out the government's legislative programme, we are committed to deliver new legislation to meet our ambitions to protect consumers and enable trusted adoption of the new technologies, working with industry, academia and international partners. The new Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Bill will make sure all consumer connected products sold to consumers in the UK adhere to minimum cybersecurity standards. This legislation, which will apply across the whole UK, aims to protect consumers at home, but also demonstrate our continued global leadership in cybersecurity. Going back to 2016, our objective within the National Cybersecurity Strategy was that the majority of online products and services coming into use become secure by default by this year. And as I've just outlined, we have seen success through the publication of our Code of Practice and the adoption of these 13 principles abroad and within globally applicable standards from international standards bodies. However, aspects of industry still persist in using out-of-date and dangerous practices such as universal default passwords, and the risks to consumers can no longer be tolerated. Our planned legislation will further close the door on this insecure technology and help protect consumers in the UK, whether at home or in the workplace. And of course, the boundary between home and workplace is increasingly blurred, and this will be introduced fairly soon into Parliament. I hope that's been helpful as a little scene setter for today's discussion. I'm looking forward to seeing the conclusions of the discussion and any recommendations. And there's an open offer from me to meet up with you again individually or collectively to continue this discussion. But for now, thank you for your attention. And I wish you a productive afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, and we'll take you up on that offer. I'm sure we'll have you back. And I think you're probably leaving, or if you're staying with us, then enjoy the rest of the proceedings. But what I will do is I'll present the next slide. So a quick introduction to myself. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Allan and I'm the founder of Intelligens Consulting. So we are telecoms and smart city, smart place advisor with clients globally. and across the UK and Scotland with investors, operators, policymakers at the senior levels of government, advising on all aspects of telecoms, from technology, strategy, policy, commercial and economic advice. If you haven't come across Intelligens before, please do reach out to me or through our website, contact us on LinkedIn or send me an email at intelligensconsulting.com. So once we start today, the first part is really around just kind of setting the scene for IoT. What do we mean by IoT? There's a lot of misunderstandings around IoT. Is it technology? Is it a system or is it a process? And what I've really tried to do here, what we'll do over the next few slides, is just kind of make it a bit easier, try and kind of unpack the various elements of IoT and what that means. And as I said, towards the end, we'll get to what IoT is in terms of a smart place and how you can adopt IoT into smart place outcomes for local authorities. So here what you can see is there's 4 elements, and I won't dwell on this in too much detail because I know that Stephen CENSIS has got a very similar diagram. We'll be able to present this a lot more in a lot more detail, but it comprises of 4 main components. You've got sensors, you've got a backhaul network, then you've got the processing element, and then a presentation and analytics. And the whole point of IoT is really to collect data to enable us as users, as decision makers, as policy makers, to make decisions based on data and evidence and to make smarter decisions. And those sensors could be anything from cameras to movement detectors to temperature sensors, and you name it. Anything that collects data would be classified as a sensor. Now, in between that, to get that data to where it needs to be processed, you need a network. And typically, through the research, what we're hearing a lot is, LoRaWAN technology is equated synonymously with IoT. But in fact, I think part of what we want today is unpack that and kind of demystify. Yes, LoRaWAN is a really good technology for IoT, but actually the scope of IoT is much broader than just LoRaWAN. So that backhaul network could be absolutely anything. We'll come on to those options, technology options later on. I won't talk too much about processing, but that essentially takes the data, and the core component here is really the presentation analytics, how that data is then interpreted, analysed and presented to users. Now, these are senior officers or decision makers within local authorities or policymakers in government, and how best to act upon that data. And the most, you make really insightful decisions that save on costs and improve productivity. The worst to do nothing, and we'll carry on as normal. So IoT is currently in its infancy. It's deployed typically in very low complexity situations. So situations that don't require a lot of intelligence, and situations that don't require a lot of complex analysis of the senses, essentially. And the point of that is that it frees up valuable resources within local authorities or government to undertake some more intelligent tasks. So what I've got here is a small grid that shows you that along the bottom, complexity of tasks, and along the vertical, the amount of intelligence required. So what we've seen through this research is a lot of the use cases that are used for IoT, at least in the initial case, are deployed in situations where actually you don't need a lot of intelligence. They're quite, you're just collecting maybe a single or a couple of senses, for example, dampness or monitoring movement, and sending that information onwards to the platforms and systems to then be processed. So it's not an overly complex use of technology, but that's the genius of IoT. Where you have very expensive human resource and officer time being deployed, say, for example, to do visual inspections, inspections that really require tick boxes. If you can replace that with a sensor, a visual sensor or a movement sensor or temperature sensor, whatever that sense might be that you wish to detect, then actually that's where IoT starts to make sense, and that becomes part of that business case. And it frees up that resource time to then analyze that data and do something a bit more clever about that data. So so take actions. Now, gradually over time, I would expect the complexity of those tasks being undertaken by IoT and those sensors to increase, particularly as analytics and software becomes more complex or more sophisticated, I should say, and also as we start to overlay artificial intelligence to analyze that data. So the use cases will gradually increase. The final thing I want to say here is, of the local authorities that we interviewed and spoke to as a part of this research, what was really clear is start with one single anchor use case rather than trying to boil the ocean. Yep. So, get one use case, make that break even, prove the business case for it, make it work, get a platform in place, and then you can build on top of that. So that's really one of the essential takeaways from the research. So many of you might be thinking, why should we do IoT? And what are the benefits? So again, through the research, we've kind of condensed a lot of the benefits into two core outcomes. There's the kind of operational outcomes that you have as a local authority. These can be subdivided into 4 categories. So you might want to improve your service delivery to businesses or to your citizens. You might want to reduce or avoid certain costs that keep recurring and therefore impacting the balance sheets. There's also a potential to optimise revenue income to the council and also to enhance productivity. And secondly, you might want to increase or have an impact on the kind of social and economic place-based outcomes. So, for example, there might be interventions where you want to improve the livelihood of people living in social housing, for example. You might want to, obviously, with COP coming around and the emphasis on the environment, deploy sensors to improve how we respond to the environment, so maybe to reduce traffic, reduce CO2 emissions, and also to drive economic impact. Now, I've got some examples over here. Now, I'm not going to go over these in a lot of detail because I know Stephen has got some use cases that he'd like to talk about. But I think it would be useful just to touch on, which comes first. Is it the productivity or the kind of the social economic outcomes, or is it the productivity and cost benefits for local authorities? And the answer is you could actually do one or the other or both. It doesn't really matter as long as your business case can demonstrate tangible benefits. And I'll demonstrate that here. So, for example, in social housing, sensors are typically deployed to avoid costs recurring. So, from maintenance and dampness and rot. Typically there's high levels of cost and repair associated with properties that may experience damp or rot. So by deploying sensors, you can avoid those costs. But there's also secondary benefits that we've realised through social housing and deploying sensors. So if you deploy sensors that also monitor temperature and movement, you can start to determine fuel poverty. So households that might be below a certain threshold of temperature all year round, that can trigger a social impact or a response from the local authority to deploy some other resources to intervene, because it might be a social issue, a fuel poverty issue that needs to be intervened upon. So there's all sorts of secondary benefits that can be determined, and depending upon what the council priorities are at that time, be it council cost avoidance or be it social impact, you can drive that business case either way. Either one can be primary, and you can still have secondary benefits as a result. The streetlights are also quite interesting because the obvious use case here is where you can start to detect faults automatically. Typically, faults are reported to local authorities in the winter because that's when streetlights are most visible. But by deploying streetlight sensors, in fact, there's secondary benefits. In fact, there's quite a few secondary and tertiary benefits. So one key secondary benefit is that, by being able to detect faults throughout the year, you spread the load of those faults and the load in the fault repair team throughout the year, so you avoid this kind of resource crunch that happens between November and March, which are the dark months, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. So it kind of helps with load management. And there's also kind of a third benefit, which is if you deploy movement sensors into streetlights, you can also reduce insurance claims by correlating when perhaps streetlights get knocked down by cars and avoiding insurance claims. You can correlate that with CCTV footage and then find out who the perpetrator was and kind of send them the bill. So waste is also quite interesting. You know, the example we looked at here, they identified how to optimize waste collection cycles, but also they identified through one of the pilots that the bins they were using were too small, so it actually increased the size of the bins, and that improved massively in terms of litter and pickup time, so reduced a lot of waste that was gathering in full bins and avoiding the bins from overflowing. So some really interesting use cases and benefits. That brings my first part of the report findings to an end. I think just slightly ahead, slightly beyond schedule. So next we have Stephen Milne of CENSIS, and Stephen will then pass on to Alasdair, Rettie of North. If you can come off mute, Stephen. There you are. And Stephen, please introduce yourself, and I will disappear. And by all means, if you do have any questions, please do fire them through. We'll try and ask Stephen towards the end of the session. And again, if you don't get your questions through, we'll ask them right at the very end. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Iqbal. Could you hand over slide control to me there?
I will work that one out here. And here we are. All good?
Yeah, that's good. You see my slide there, can you? So hi everyone, good afternoon, and great to be here to chat to you today about some of the use cases that are happening in Scotland. This is really just a quick taster of some of what's going on. There's a huge amount of activity in IoT space within the Scotland, all the way through from kind of initial pilot phase through to we're starting to see some starting to hit some significant scale. So it's really exciting. We're at that point in that upward curve where we're starting to see use cases really expanding and people really understanding how they can make value of IoT, make use of it, and then get that kind of efficiency saving that is talked about a lot with IoT technologies. So at CENSIS, CENSIS is the innovation centre for sensors, imaging, and Internet of Things. So we've got a core focus on the application space. So that's everything from the hardware through the communication side and the software element. So really thinking of IoT as a full system, looking at the full value of that system and how everything can be connected together to create that value. So we typically work with lots of different companies and public sector organizations to help them understand and actually deploy bits of technology that can help them solve business problems. So hopefully today I'll give you some of a taster of some of these technologies we've used in the past. So when we refer to IoT, I often classify it as being in 4 different phases of IoT. So this kind of references some of what Iqbal was saying in his presentation, but really at the start of using IoT, a lot of people aren't really sure exactly what information is important, what they really need to make that business decision. So we always say the first phase of that is really about just collecting data, getting devices deployed, doing small trials where you can actually understand the value of that data and then how you can make use of that within your existing systems. So once you've understood that, use cases, how that potentially fits in, it goes into the second phase, which is really the alerting phase. So that's really the first phase of having a bit more intelligence in IoT, whereby you're starting to get the results back from that alerting. For example, if temperatures go beyond a certain value, or there's an alert status, for example, in a home where someone's getting cared for. So that kind of real-time monitoring, alerting is kind of probably the phase that most IoT is at the moment. And most trials are really at that kind of alerting phase. They'll typically display data on dashboards. People will be able to see the alerts, get that feedback, be able to understand exactly what's happening within their system or whatever it is they're monitoring. But as that builds, and as we say, as we move through this at different levels of IoT, we're seeing the kind of return on investment starting to increase because you're starting to get more value out of your system. You're starting to understand a bit more about kind of how to actually action from the data. So rather than just kind of collecting data, the IoT is giving you that quality level of data that lets you be able to kind of really have actions based upon what that data is. So really having that kind of action So what's the value of data? What is the actionable insights you're recording? And a lot of projects we see, people are a little bit afraid at start of having extra data. So it's not until they see how that data can be analysed and really kind of shown in a simple format, so that they can kind of really understand how it can be used and how they can use that data to really improve the efficiency of what is they're monitoring and increase that value of what they're doing. And the final phase is really the prediction phase. So once you're in that situation where you're starting to gather lots of different data from lots of different sites, you're really starting to hit that phase where you've got big data, you're starting to understand a lot more about your assets. So for example, you might start to understand when things are going to fail. So you can actually target maintenance based upon that and have people in place really kind of making sure that whatever it is you're using, whatever service you're providing, never really breaks down. It's the best service that you can possibly have. And using IoT is quite fundamental for that process. And we see a lot of this kind of building into the kind of wider digital twin world, where there's a lot of hype and a lot of talk around kind of creating digital twins of, for example, cities, buildings, and even kind of machinery, looking at that. So it's really getting that quality of data from those sensor devices and getting it back to that place where that data analysis can happen is a really powerful thing. Once you've got that, you can really start getting a lot more insights into the data. There's also quite a lot of depth in this area as well around kind of machine learning and artificial intelligence, whereby you'll start to have a lot more processing of the data on the device itself. So that's quite an interesting area because it gets around a lot of the GDPR issues that might be associated with sending data up to the cloud. It also has got advantages over power saving and just in general, just having data processed on device rather than pushing it to a central location. So one of the use cases we've been running at the moment is this use case came out of initially the Glasgow region deal had a smart infrastructure group, so they were quite interested. This is about 3-4 years ago now. They were quite interested to look at what sort of IoT technologies could be deployed. So we ran a seminar with the local government digital office, and it was really great because we had really good buy-in from very senior level local authorities, really interested in what they could use. So it really helped us straight away get in contact with people that are really kind of at that decision-making level within the local authorities. So out of all those discussions, we came down to looking at a use case, looking at improving winter maintenance program by having sensor devices deployed across remote regions within the local authority that could monitor the road temperatures, which in turn could allow the local authorities to have much more kind of decision making on where to actually send the gritters at certain points. So for example, they knew of areas where there was particular ice issues in more remote areas, so they wanted to have sensors deployed in those areas so they could action the vehicles to go out at the right point and not waste money by sending vehicles out when the road wasn't in a freezing condition. So what was really interesting about this project was this came out of a program we ran 2 years ago with the Scottish Government to really increase the uptake of IoT and make people understand how it was used. What we did is we worked with East Renfrewshire Council to look at how they could kind of integrate the IoT data into their existing systems within the council. So they used a GIS system to really kind of enable the roads team. So the roads team were quite comfortable using GIS systems for their day-to-day operation. So what was quite nice was we were able to kind of put the live data into a layer in that GIS system so that the people, operatives within the local authority, didn't have to look at a new dashboard, they didn't have to look at a new way of working for what they were doing. They could just really pop up what they always used, but really have that new information stream from the sensor. So it was really quite powerful. Another great thing that we had as well was that the council took the data streams themselves and started kind of building into their own systems and adding in more decision type support into that. So it was a very nice way to see how a local authority can take in a new live data stream, implement that into an existing IT system they already use and start getting value from that. So this trial ran over the last winter season, and the idea is to scale that up this winter season into a bigger trial. So we're working with North to put this out in their packs. So hopefully we'll get this out in a few more local authorities over the next year. get further trialing, further data, and really kind of build this into a much bigger use case, because there's multiple different other elements to this, such as kind of the grit bins and things like kind of rain gauges, everything like that, to understand that full winter maintenance program. So you can see that as Iqbal said at the start, you can start to layer the data, start to kind of add to that and build upon it. This next example, this is another program that came out of the Scottish Government program we ran 2 years ago. So this was working with Stirling Council, and they were interested in understanding the actual usage patterns and footfall of the West Highland Way. All the West Highland Way, the long distance walking route, people using that just had estimated values of how many people used it. So they wanted to see if there was a way that they could use and utilize technology to really kind of give that extra data to the local businesses, so that they, for example, they could understand if they could potentially direct more people to the businesses, have special offers, or have kind of pop-up cafes on the route. So again, what was interesting with this one was we deployed it around Drimmen, and they were particularly interested because a lot of people just bypass Drimmen and West Highland Way and keep walking. So they were very interested to see how many people walked past Drimmen, or how many people actually turned left and visited the city, the town centre. So what's particularly interesting with this project is Stirling have created a kind of, again using a GIS software, have created a kind of completely open data format where anyone in the community can see that data. They can start to analyse exactly what's happening within that smart village and use that data for other ways. It's completely open with APIs, and they're kind of really kind of using that to try and build upon across the whole Stirling region and really add other data sources into that, build it up as a really nice community resource where people can start to view the data in the community and start to extract more value out of it. So it's a really interesting way. Again, it's based upon a couple of use cases to start with, but as that progresses, it's about layering on extra use cases and adding value to that. Another one that is just about to start is one that we're involved in called the Digital Dairy Value Chain. So this is funded by Innovate UK and the UK government. It's a Strength in Places project. So it's a large 5-year grant program that's focused on the full value chain of dairy. So that's everything to do with land management, through the animal management, the farmers, the supply chain, and everything that's associated with that, through to the actual kind of end users, consumers of that. So what's interesting in this is it spans all the way from the Glasgow region through down to the south of the Lake District. And the idea of this is over the 5 years, we're going to look at enabling technologies such as IoT, machine learning, blockchain, and how they can be applied to the dairy sector. And the idea in our part of CENSIS is we're going to work in that to work with 25 companies across the 5 years to help accelerate those different use cases, really start building value, allowing the companies that work through that to have ready-made test beds and the whole wraparound end-to-end kind of life cycle of what's happening. So it's a really exciting, it's going to be a really interesting project that looks at the full value chain of that and how technology can be applied. Another project we are currently involved in is the Blackwood Neighbourhoods for Independent Living. So in the healthcare space, it's one of the, I would refer to it as one of the biggest use cases of IoT at the moment. The digital telecare program in Scotland's migrating from analog services to digital. So within the next 3-year period, there's going to be 180,000 users of IoT type technologies in home to make sure that they are living well and independently. So the migration from analog to digital is really creating a lot of opportunities, because you've got a huge amount of extra service that can be provided through the digital services. So with the Blackwood project, it's really looking at the whole concept of the neighbourhood as a whole. So how can you ensure that people living in the neighbourhood can utilise technology to live longer, healthier lives in the community? So it really covers everything from electrical vehicles through to kind of social interaction and exercise, all the way through to kind of living at home and making sure that people can get what they require when and where. So again, this project's just started, but again, hugely exciting. IoT is going to play a huge part in it. As you can imagine, these kind of community level or groups where you're looking at kind of clusters of maybe kind of 500 houses. So It's got a huge user design element to it, so really working closely with the tenants and the community to understand what sort of services it could be provided, what sort of new innovations could start to emerge. So really exciting. I think we're hopefully going to see some very, very interesting new novel use cases of IoT emerging here, and also hoping to see that that does actually benefit the community and actually does make their lives better. So yeah, this is my last slide. So just if anyone wants to read any more, please go to the CENSIS website. We've got a number of getting started guides. It cuts across a number of the areas we're talking today and talks through a lot of the jargon about IoT, how it can be deployed, what are the various business models that are used in IoT. And we're also starting to put together a map of some of the key IoT projects in Scotland. I referenced earlier that some are starting to hit some really good scale. So we're looking for examples of that. So if anyone on the call has got an example of any really interesting projects that's happening, then please get in contact, let us know. We'd love to get that on our IoT map and get that promoted. So thanks for listening today. I'll be happy to take questions at the end. And I will hand over to Alasdair.
Thanks, Stephen. I think we'll go straight to Alasdair. We'll get questions at the end. Just a quick reminder, if you are listening, there's a question panel at the bottom of your panel there, so do fire any questions through. We'll take them at the end of the session. On you go, Alasdair.
Hi, Stephen. Yep. Afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present today. I'm just going to talk about IoT Scotland, the network. A little bit about North. So North are private equity owned, coming together of 7 different companies. We focus on 3 areas: networking and connectivity, safety and security, and the Internet of Thing and smart places. Internet of Thing is what we're actually going to be talking about today. Just a little over 70 million turnover, based in Glasgow and various other locations throughout the UK. But as I said, we're going to be talking about IoT Scotland today in terms of the LoRaWAN network. So IoT Scotland's a joint project involving Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and North. And the objective behind it was to create a national IoT network for Scotland. The network is open to private and public sector, and it offers the transformational potential to explore the use of deploying sensors, gathering in data, and allowing public and private sector organizations to use that data to improve services, deliver new services, and will make faster and smarter business decisions. The network is being rolled out at no cost to local councils. So we've been working with councils and various other partners, including the likes of ScotRail, some universities and colleges, to deploy these gateways and get the coverage in place. The coverage currently is available in 29 of the 32 local authority areas. The map on the right there shows you the sort of existing coverage. Blue is where we have existing gateways. Orange is where it's scheduled to be deployed. We've recently also signed up an agreement with CloudNet to get coverage in Orkney as well. So Orkney will be covered as well coming forward. As I said, we've been working closely with partnerships, whether that's councils, housing associations like Blackwood and Eildon Housing, ScotRail, and various colleges and universities. To date, the project's been running for over 2 years. To date, we've planned over 800, so 839 sites have been planned on desktop planning. We physically visited 633 to do surveys, and we've got 462 gateways deployed. Now, these are covering the majority of towns and cities, so major urban areas in Scotland, but also a number of rural areas as well. So we've got coverage in Cairngorms, and we've got coverage in Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park. As I said, it's been going for 2 years now. The build phase of this project is coming to an end at the end of this month, and then we'll be moving into the operational phase to work with clients to get solutions running on top of this network. Part of the incentives we've done to help councils and other partners get IoT solutions on board is we're offering fully funded IoT accelerator packs. So this is a no commitment offer. We will fund a pack. Each pack's worth around about £15,000 and consists of sensors, network access, and the relevant application for the client to trial for a 12-month period. Throughout that 12 months, we'll give full support on implementation, and there are options to expand and retain that pack if required. But as I said at the beginning, there is no commitment here. If at the end of the 12 months, the council have learned and understand how they want to take IoT forward, and they don't wish to use the solution we've offered, they're free to take a solution from any other provider. The network is open to councils or other providers to put network sensors onto the network. And equally, I think as some of the other speakers have said, LoRaWAN, which is what IoT Scotland is based on, is one of a range of different IoT technologies that are available in Scotland. And any solution can use one or all of those network technologies. The 6 packs that we initially rolled out and have been taken up to a varying extent by partners, we have intelligent street lighting. So we have the solution where we can deploy 75 street lighting nodes to allow a council to trial and test street lighting, intelligent street lighting. We have waste management, where they have access to 50 waste management sensors to deploy into bins and monitor fill levels and look at how they can automate and improve the service level within waste management. We have water monitoring, which is a solution offered by one of our IoT Scotland partners, M2M, which monitors the water systems within a building to warn of any risks of Legionella and other bacteria forming. Very relevant at the moment, air quality. We're offering 15 external air quality sensors to be deployed around a city or a town to measure air quality levels, along with the data analysis platform to look at the readings and make judgments from that. We also have a social housing solution where we can carry out an MOT on a property, identify any issues that could cause damp and mold due to the fabric of the property, but then install IoT sensors to give real-time data to allow the tenant to be educated on what they should and shouldn't necessarily be doing within a house that may cause damp and mold conditions to prevail. And then the last one is another one from one of the IoT Scotland partners, again M2M. Again, this is very relevant. It's building health and monitoring CO2 levels. So this can be used within offices or schools. High levels of CO2 are a good indicator of bad air quality. And obviously in the current climate with coronavirus, then you want to turn on your air conditioning, open windows and reduce the level of CO2 and therefore improve air quality. Equally within schools, high levels of CO2 are not good for concentration level within pupils. And obviously the recent decision by the Scottish Government that all councils will have CO2 sensors within schools is a very good step forward. We have added an additional one. So again, in line with what Stephen was talking about earlier, we're offering in partnership with CENSIS a road surface temperature sensor pack, which provides access to 5 road surface temperature sensors, a rain gauge, and the relevant applications and support for that on a GIS platform or a data analysis platform. And that will allow, especially coming into the winter seasons, for the relevant partners to review and look at the data that comes back from those sensors. I'll just cover a couple of slides on, we've been working with various councils. I've got some examples in the next few slides of what we've done with Highland Council, working closely with them. The first slide here is on water quality, where they've deployed the solution from M2M. It basically is a proactive water risk monitoring solution. So you attach sensors to the relevant parts of the water system within the building, and it will de-skill and provide real context and a risk score of any issues within that water system. So it will monitor, the sensors will monitor for temperature, make sure it doesn't go out any sort of preset levels, but it will also monitor for flow motions. So within a water system of a building, if the showers haven't been used for a long time, or the toilet or taps haven't been turned on, which is obviously very relevant in the current climate, that water standing still can stagnate and cause bacteria to grow. So these sensors will actually give you that indication and allow you to direct somebody to go and flush the toilet or turn the tap on, and therefore ensure that the water safety system remains good. The actual application allows you to put it in a hierarchical organization structure. So if you've got a number of schools, you can have various people within the organization can see all of the schools and react accordingly and generate the reports. Or you can actually also give individuals within that school access to the system. So as I said earlier, they can action and make sure that the system doesn't have any alarms and alerts coming through. M2M designed this very much a mobile first approach. So the application is available on any good tablet or smartphone. It's got an open API, so all the data that is gathered can be used to generate reports, but also be used to pull off and put onto another third-party data analysis platform as required. And with all the IoT solutions that we offer, they are secure and compliant with GDPR requirements. Another project we did with the Highland Council, Highland Council have got an area the size of Belgium, so quite a large area to cover, and quite a lot of it is rural. They've got several thousand buildings spread across this area, and only the larger buildings will have a building management system in place. What they wanted was the ability to have sensors deployed across these various buildings and gather in readings that will allow them to reduce their carbon footprint and improve their energy management. The council were already working with Glasgow-based company IES using their carbon footprint reduction and energy management solution. And what we did is we provided IoT Scotland coverage within various buildings and provided a range of sensors from temperature and humidity sensors for outside the buildings and inside, PIR movement sensors so we can detect when somebody actually comes into the building, window and door sensors, along with the ability to remotely read electrical meter readings so they can see how much energy is being used in that property. And having this sort of information available allowed them to actually see how the buildings were being used. So is that building 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, or is it 9 to 5 7 days a week, and align the heating system with the usage of that building and make savings that way, but also improve the buildings for the users of that building, the public and the employees. The solution was based around internal LoRaWAN gateways using the gateway as a service model. So as I said earlier, we're deploying these IoT Scotland gateways in towns and cities across Scotland. For the more rural areas where it's maybe just one building and one client that has a requirement there, we can provide a standalone internal gateway that will provide coverage within that building and report back into the main network, and it's a much more cost-effective way of providing that solution and deployment. What we can see here is some data that's come out from a school. We have a range of sensors in place, and we can see at the top one here we've got motion events, so it actually shows you that school is used 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, and you can see the corresponding internal temperature readings that are taken. We've got an external temperature and humidity sensor, so again you can see what the temperature is outside, which is very good when you're comparing what the central heating system's doing and what you should have it set to. And interestingly, you can also see the CO2 levels on the bottom trace here again. So the background level on CO2 is typically 500 or 600 parts per million. Again, within this slide, you can see that that's peaking at 1800 parts per million. At that sort of levels, you then need to start looking at the air conditioning being switched on and enabled, or the windows being opened. And again, the main reasons behind that are within a classroom environment, the air can get stuffy and the concentration levels of the pupils can be affected. So having that insight allows you to react accordingly. And the final project that we're working with the Highland Council, and they're also undertaking to change the systems within a number of their social housing properties, where they're taking out gas boilers and putting in air source heat pumps and PV panels. So we provided the IoT solution to allow them to measure the data and report on the solution efficiencies. So we deployed some external temperature and humidity sensors to get that basic information around how the systems are working. And we then also deployed current clamps and sensors that will measure the electrical energy used. So how much comes into the property, how much is then used to run the air source heat pump, how much energy does the photovoltaic panels generate, and from all of that information we can work out how efficient the overall system is. We also put some sensors onto the central heating and hot water systems so we can measure the thermal efficiency of those systems. All of that information is available on a data analysis platform. And in line with the government advice now to change everything to air source heat pumps, Highland Council have been very forward thinking and are just making sure that actually the efficiencies that they expect from this sort of system is what they're actually going to achieve. The next steps, my final slide. I mentioned earlier that we're coming to the end of the build phase of IoT Scotland. So what next? So we're going to continue to operate the network on an open access basis. So it's available for anybody to use on a per sensor price basis. We're going to continue to deliver and support the accelerator packs that we've been signed up with and ensure we support councils and other partners. We're going to continue to expand the network and infill where there are gaps in the network that's already in place. Continuing to support our partner ecosystem. There's a number of small startup companies that are benefiting from the solution that we've developed so far. And overall provide that consultancy and support to our partners and clients so that they can take advantage of IoT and all it offers. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Alasdair. You put me back on as presenter, please. So really interesting presentations. Thank you both, Stephen and Alasdair. We'll take questions towards the end. Hopefully you can see my screen now. So luckily you've got my my mug to look at the next 10 minutes. So getting into the real kind of juicy parts of IoT, and particularly if you're involved in policy, economic decisions, then you'll want to understand how do you make a business case for IoT. And this is exactly what I'm covering here. So now the financial case is actually very clear. And I set out in this research not really being very clear on the ROI, the return on investment, but actually it was, as you can see here, they presented the outcomes of two example projects that I've analysed. Now, it's not based on actual council figures, and the numbers have been anonymised to protect commercial sensitivity. So on the left-hand side, you've got essentially a cash flow break-even analysis over a period of 5 years, which breaks even in year 4 for a social housing implementation of IoT. And on the right-hand side, you've got an 8 to 9 year period analysis of the costs and the cash flow involved in a smart streetlight. So as you can see, that pays back within the 7 to 8 years, so around about 7.5 years. So how was this done? So this is created by looking at the costs that will cost to deploy an IoT solution, analyze the benefits in terms of productivity savings, the kind of the cost savings I talked about earlier, and overlaying that on top of the initial cash outlay. Now, both of these networks are based on LoRaWAN, and as I said, LoRaWAN isn't the only IoT technology out there, or network technology, we should say. But just what happens are both based on LoRaWAN, and also not on IoT Scotland. They're based on private LoRaWAN examples. So just to kind of make the numbers stack up, we've also assumed when I did the analysis that that the social housing was fully populated with IoT. So every social house premise had an IoT sensor placed in, and all the smart streetlights, were enabled. But as you can see, there's a really tangible, demonstrable payback with social housing within year 4 after deployment. I think that's really exciting for those of you who are making financial cases. The other thing to understand is this excludes any of the productivity benefits. So currently within social housing, you'll have officers that go out to the site visits. Once you kind of start to eliminate that cost, and you replace that whole ability of just keeping the officers to doing more complex tasks, you can actually start to break even within a 2 to 3 year period. So that break even comes even forward. And actually this becomes that anchor use case on top of which you can then build other use cases, be it social housing or be it smart streetlights, for example. Now, the example on the right is, as I say, smart streetlights. Now, this looks at the cost saved due to the productivity savings of not having to send out teams of men and women at midnight analysing and looking at streetlights and making recordings and coming back. And so the cost saved of doing that is what's reflected in the cost saving here. When you overlay this cost with an LED replacement program, that cost payback vastly improves to about 3 to 4 years. So this is just a snapshot, and I've got detailed models and cost models that sit behind this, and we've used numbers from real life examples to demonstrate, to make these numbers more real. So hopefully that kind of reassures anyone who's uncertain that there is a financial case and it is possible to make a business case on the numbers for IoT. Now, there's a number of considerations, and again, I think a lot of caution. Let's, if people just go out after the webinar, so let's do IoT is great. I think, kind of stand back and hold horses for a bit, because there's a lot of consideration and thought that needs to go into designing IoT, and as we'll come to learn in a few slides, I think there's some bigger considerations we need to take into account. One of those considerations is the commercial model. Now, as I mentioned, those two examples that I presented previously were based on fixed upfront costs. The advantage of that is, it's really great if you have a very big scale deployment, so thousands of sensors, and you're looking at a very high scale deployment. The disadvantage with that approach is obviously, there's a high upfront capital cost. Now, so you need to understand the scale of your deployment. If that is quite a small scale deployment, then you might be better suited with a pay-as-you-go or a shared type network where you have smaller upfront costs, but the ongoing costs are in line with the scale. So if it's a small scale project, your cost risk or cost exposure is likely to be a lot less. Now, there's other models available. You could even chop and change and create a hybrid fixed and shared pay-as-you-go type model. But it really requires a lot more foresight than just let's do IoT and social housing and bang away you go and source. That would be the worst thing you could possibly do after this webinar. And if you do that, I've failed in my job to convince you. I've jumped a few slides ahead there, apologies. And as we've said a few times throughout, so both Stephen and Alasdair both mentioned, the technology options are not limited to LoRaWAN. In fact, a few of the examples that we looked at involve satellite and cellular, and possibly even Wi-Fi. But the technology mix for the network component of IoT is beyond LoRaWAN. So I've highlighted cellular, so mobile, Wi-Fi, fiber, LoRaWAN itself, and there's other narrowband IoT technologies, satellite, which we'll talk about in more detail later, and also radio networks. But actually, the problem we've created in industry is that we've become very technology centric, and I'm partly responsible. Advisors and analysts, and also the minister and government. We talk about being the best 5G nation. We talk about being fully fibre enabled, gigabit enabled. These are very technology bottom up led interventions, and I think we need to just again stop and think what are we actually trying to do. And again, we'll cover that in more detail later. So how do you determine the best technology? Well, first, it's the last thing you consider when you're deploying an IoT strategy. If your IoT strategy is about buying a fiber network, a Wi-Fi network, or a LoRaWAN network, then you need to give me a call or stop and rethink. That's the technology is the last thing you want to be able to do. The things you do need to think about is, well, what do we want to do now? What are future requirements and use cases? So if those use cases require a lot of scale, then you might want to consider the technology model. And if cellular, for example, doesn't scale very well, the cost of cellular scales with the number of sensors. So if you're using 4G, as you deploy more 4G enabled sensors, the cost of that network increases with the number of sensors you deploy. The cost of that will increase as well. And if you run into the thousands, and we've proven this in one of the case studies we look, it does not break even and it will not work. So you might think there's a great option initially because 4G coverage is almost everywhere, up to 78%. But but that's maybe not the best way of going about it. You also might want to think about what are the other technologies that are currently in the ground, maybe council owned, or maybe just publicly owned through other third parties or by private organizations. So do you have existing Wi-Fi coverage? Are the properties and premises you're trying to enable fiber enabled? Do you have satellite coverage, for example? You can use any other network technology. It saves you from investing in a new network component. You also need to understand what kind of data you want to collect. And if that data is high bandwidth, if it's, let's say, image data in your sensors or cameras, a LoRaWAN network isn't going to cut that. So you need something with a bit more bandwidth, a bit more meat. So I would point to something with a bit more bandwidth, possibly fiber, possibly something else. And the other thing you want to think about is the regularity with which you want to collect that data. So if it's lots of data points, it might be small data points, but lots of small data points can add up to quite a big amount of bandwidth, or it might just be a small amount of data points, not very often. That will influence the technology that you buy or source as part of this IoT solution. And again, will have a significant impact on your financial case and the business model. It could destroy that entire business case. So, you know, again, reiterating, do not jump to the technology first. That's the last thing to consider. I thought I had another slide there, but I don't. So I am now going to hand over to Allan, who very conveniently is going to be talking about the role of satellite. I will hide my screen and give you control, Allan. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see my slideshow. Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. It's great to be with you all today. Thanks to Iqbal, North and CENSIS for some great insights. I'm Allan Cannon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of R3IoT. We're headquartered in Glasgow and work across several markets, helping organisations digitise through the use of our space-enabled technology. I, along with my co-founder, previously worked in the exciting upstream part of the Scottish space ecosystem. We put satellites on orbit and we got to work with the likes of NASA and lots of exciting space tech companies from across the world. We decided to start R3IoT because we realised that there was a lot of people working on the space bit of the technology stack, but not enough people working on the ground bit. And this bit is critical in enabling the value to be extracted from the technology going into orbit. I'm going to discuss why space and the incredible disruption happening in the industry today is having an incredible ripple-down effect, providing organisations like yours the opportunity to provide better services, reduce costs, and in some cases, save lives. When an organisation has distributed assets or operations to manage, and these are spread across wide geographic areas, there is an operational burden that results. This burden can mean several things to the organisation: a high cost to manage, a latency in the data, meaning that often the data is low quality, a high risk and health and safety implications as a result. All of this leads to huge inefficiencies in areas of operational blindness. Now, did you know that 90% of the planet lacks sufficient communications infrastructure? Now, this is a bit of a mind-blowing fact, but makes a lot of sense. Comms infrastructure is mainly available in areas where people are. Population centres, cities, not in rural areas where there's only a couple of users. This results in key digital services being unavailable or unreliable in rural areas. The main cause being that infrastructure investment is weighted towards urban and peri-urban areas, as it's much easier to close a business case for deployment of, say, a 4G mast in an area with thousands of users compared to closing a business case to invest where there are less than 10. Providing service to a rural end user in Scotland costs vastly more to provide than that same equivalent service to an end user in Glasgow or Edinburgh. Now, we've all heard of Elon Musk and SpaceX and the incredible Starlink technology going onto orbit in the form of thousands of communication satellites. Have you also heard of OneWeb, the UK government's backed constellation? Both of these companies have the aim to provide telecommunication services to anywhere on Earth. And it's not just them. We have Jeff Bezos and Amazon planning comm services through their Project Kuiper, many dedicated satellite missions providing fantastic new comms infrastructure. Now, this is having a dramatic effect on the global space telecoms industry. Traditionally expensive and complex, space comms was used mainly by governments and energy companies to provide service to remote areas. If you could afford it, you could purchase a terminal for tens of thousands of pounds and you'd get your data service, which you'd also need to pay tens of thousands of pounds for. This meant that space comms was only available to a few. Now, this is changing as we speak due to the new players entering the market. We're seeing a shift downward in the cost of space-based data, resulting in the democratization of services. No longer do you need to have a big budget to utilize space tech, but the tech can be accessed for a fraction of the traditional cost. Now, what does this mean for rural businesses and service providers? It means that right now, from a technological perspective, there is no digital divide. The technology exists now to enable the same digital services in rural and remote areas as those provided in urban areas. This means that we have a huge opportunity to level up the playing field for organisations who are carrying this huge operational burden, due to the simple fact that they have their operation based in a rural environment. All these fantastic use cases are now available. We don't have to run fibre across the country to provide service. We can leverage satellites in combination with the more traditional forms of communication to maximise utility. A great example of where this levelling up is happening has been forced by the changing and evolving landscape of telecoms. In 2025, or in some cases as early as 2023, BT will turn off support for the analogue PSTN services that forms the communication backbone for telecare services in the UK. This means that if you are one of these rural areas not served by another digital communication service, be that cellular or fibre, then there is a huge risk that come 2025, there will be no way of providing critical telecare services. At the moment, the plan is to utilise the 3G and 4G cellular networks to provide the service, but as we all know, in rural areas of the country, that service is not guaranteed and definitely not reliable enough to provide what is a life-saving critical service. At R3, we've been working with the Digital Office and several telecare providers to unlock the potential of satellite-based technologies to provide utility in telecare and wider digital health services. This project has the potential to provide much needed critical care digital services anywhere in the UK, completely independently of any local communications infrastructure, over highly reliable and secure backhauls. It's an exciting step in demonstrating why the new technology going into orbit is going to change the way we deliver healthcare and many other services here in the UK, but also across the world. In healthcare, across the pandemic period, we've seen a mass digitisation where the industry as a whole has adopted digital technologies at a rate never seen before. This is great news for patients who rely on access to healthcare, but there is still a big issue. The care and services available for patients in Glasgow is still very different for a patient on Skye or Isla. Satellite-enabled care is a way for us as a country to level up our digital divide. Provision of the same quality of care in a metropolitan area to a rural area has to be the aim. And it doesn't stop at healthcare. In fact, any industry or organisation operating in a rural or remote environment who are currently at a competitive disadvantage can benefit from space technology. We have demonstrated the potential for improved productivity and efficiency gains in several high-impact markets such as aquaculture, environmental monitoring, and in mission-critical use cases such as emergency services. We've found many organisations suffer from having to manage assets and operations across areas where there is no effective alternative but to send someone to collect data or monitor performance. We are seeing huge opportunities to utilise space-based technology to help organisations become more efficient, more productive, and reduce their risk. Just think of the cost saving for your organisation if, rather than sending someone every day to collect maintenance data, this could be automated and moved to a centralised business intelligence platform, enabling the organisation to move to a more preventative maintenance model. IoT has the potential to benefit millions globally. A huge barrier to adoption is reliable communications infrastructure and the ability to deploy these game-changing services anywhere on the planet. We have a great opportunity here in Scotland to leverage our incredible space, IoT and data ecosystems to provide world-class digital services, but we need investment and buy-in from policymakers. Thank you very much, and I will leave you with this final thought. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Really good presentation. We've got a few questions for you, but we will take them at the end. So if you're still listening, hopefully you still are, then we are reaching the final part of the session where we disseminate some of these report findings, and after which we will jump to a final Q&A and a wrap up and close. So please do get your questions in for the panelists, the speakers, and we'll try and do our best to answer them at the end. So I know I went on a bit of a rant there about technology, but there's a really important point and story I think that I want to tell you. So, you know, some of my clients, local authority clients, when you speak to them about IoT or fibre, 5G, whatever it might be, you know, the impression that's left is, yep, Iqbal, we're doing everything, we're on it, we're sorted. And I know they're not, because so what they may be doing is a 5G pilot, or in the early days of doing a private 5G pilot. They might be doing a very small scale social housing pilot somewhere using LoRaWAN. They might be doing some kind of rural fibre project or rural microwave type project. But in their eyes, they're covered. They've got all the bases covered, and you know there's nothing to really worry about. I then asked them, so what are you trying to achieve with all of this? And you know they're kind of stumped. Well, what do you mean? Well, what's the point of all these pilots? And they don't really have an answer for it, and that's really where we need to get to, and we need to be a bit more smarter about designing smart places, if you pardon the pun. So to get around that, you know, so before I say that, so one of the issues that creates is we have what I call IoT islands, or these kind of technology hotspots. We have disparate islands of technology which are disconnected from each other. They don't talk to each other. There's nothing common between them, and they're not reaching some common aim as being driven by the council, so they're not being driven to meet a council outcome. And that's a problem, because you know as soon as you, particularly when some of these pilots are privately funded, so there's private investment there, what you're actually doing is diluting that private investment, and you're losing the opportunity to milk that private investment to something that's really more important, rather than just taking the first cherry that's been given to you by a private operator. So really think hard where you are as a local authority, what your priorities and ambitions are before you embark on this journey. And that requires a lot of work to be undertaken before you even go to anywhere near a kind of procurement strategy or sourcing strategy. So the approach we've kind of developed, we're working with a few local authorities here, is to pioneer a kind of top-down, data-driven operating system. And if you know, it informs 3 key questions that you need to ask as a local authority. And the first thing you need to ask is, what are the outcomes you're trying to drive, and what are the benefits we want to achieve in terms of place and for the organisation, and you know which ones of these are the priority. So if you take, for example, the social housing example, you know, one priority there might have been, you know, through a stakeholder analysis and engagement you establish, you're paying a lot rot costs. We want to reduce unnecessary cost leak from the council. How do you do that? Where's the cost leakage? Well, not really sure, but let's put in some sensors to try and understand, and try and understand the data you need. So what's the data that you need to help you make those decisions? Well, we need data to understand the temperature, and is social housing a real problem, for example. And then, okay, great. So we know the problem we want to solve. We know the data that we need to try and obtain to help us understand if this truly is a problem, and therefore what's the sensing technology and digital infrastructure needed to enable and provision that data. So if you think about it top-down, economic outcomes and priority benefits that you're trying to achieve, what's the data that you need to help you make clever decisions around ways to achieve productivity, cost benefits, and place-based benefits? Then you think about the technology last. Now, it requires a real step change in the way we think as local authorities. We cannot be IT driven. It requires a joint approach between IT and economic development. I'm pleased to see a lot of economic development people on the call, but you might require IT support, but it's not an IT project. Yep, need to make that absolutely clear. This is not an IT-driven strategy. This is a place-based, CEO top-down driven strategy. It requires CEO level engagement all the way down, CEO level buy-in at the business case. How do you do this? So that's the next question you need to ask. So I've defined 6 steps that I've defined as a framework that we're using with other local authorities, with Intelligens Consulting, to deliver value, to deliver impact, and to deliver upon key priorities. And it starts with understanding, as I said, the challenges, and that's the first point. Engage with key stakeholders with the key service areas. That's across waste, roads, social housing, planning, apply missed the whole load out, education. What's keeping them awake at night? How can technology, not LoRaWAN, not 5G, not fibre, how can technology in general help them do a better job? What are the problem areas that are trying to help them understand? So what are the problem areas that are trying to resolve? Yep. Then it's okay. So we understand the kind of challenges we're trying to overcome, the benefits we're trying to achieve in the economy in terms of economic and social impact. So how do we compare with other local authorities and other cities? Well, don't really know. So that's where you start to rank and rate your own organisation, your local authority, in terms of how mature your smart place ambitions are. So how are you doing in terms of digital infrastructure? How are you doing in terms of electrical vehicle charging, etc.? So you start to look at a kind of more broad assessment of your organisation and the region in terms of maturity, in terms of smart cities, and benchmark that, and then develop from that a strategic roadmap. So when you benchmark that with your comparator local authorities or organisations more globally. From that, you should then have a kind of almost like a strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities, threats type analysis, from which you can say, well, we're weak at this, we need to address this now. This is an immediate priority. This is less important, but it's not urgent, but it's still important. So that becomes a kind of long-term strategy, right? So maybe social housing is something that's really important. Streetlights will maybe do in 2 or 3 years' time. Waste is not an issue. Let's put that in the back boiler as an example. So you then have this kind of basket of potential use cases. You then say, right, well, how do we then procure a solution around that? So what are the technology options and platform options? That's when you start to think about the technologies, developing your requirements and the options from that technology mix. In fact, you could even argue you stay away from the technology, you define outcome-based requirements, and then you head into the procurement and implementation stage. And Intelligens Consulting is working with local authorities right across that entire piece, right through from stakeholder engagement to procurement implementation and award of contract. Now, the other thing we need to be wary of at the moment is where local authorities, we are, particularly with the lack of central government funding, we're increasingly high levels of debt as a nation. Where's all this funding coming from? Now, I mentioned previously, if you're clever about how you design intervention strategy. If you don't build too many technology layers, first of all, that's the first thing to realise. You don't build multiple networks. It could be that one network is enough to achieve all your outcomes. Unlikely. It's possible you need at least more than one or two networks to complement each other, but as long as you're not necessarily overlaying each other. So beyond that, there is a lot of private sector investment out there. What's very clear, particularly in the fibre market, is a bit unique. There's billions of pounds of investment going towards fibre investment at the moment. And any local authority would be crazy to bypass that investment. So think of ways we can leverage that investment as an anchor, possibly, to create investment in fibre, investment in 5G, investment in other technologies, but then hanging on to that, your core outcomes you're trying to achieve is one way of doing that. Another way is creating SPVs, or special purpose vehicles, where the local authority has a bit more skin in the game. It's not typically very common in the UK, and I think because it's a PPP, PPPs have had a bit of a bad name in the UK since kind of big health projects, but in Europe, SPVs are really popular. So I'm really lucky to have a colleague on board that specialises in project finance and SPVs. So we have experience of creating SPVs. We have a private sector partner that can provide some of the funding, with some funding from public authorities, to create a vehicle that generates that investment in infrastructure and the platforms that you need, that delivers the outcomes that you require. And I've listed a number of other intervention options here that are also available. And again, there might be more than one way to skin the cat, but all of this should be considered as part of your options analysis before you go anywhere near a sourcing or procurement of any solution. So hopefully that is the last slide. So thank you for listening, not just to me, but also to Allan, Alasdair, and Stephen. If you want to get in touch with me, my details are there again. If you want to scan a QR code, that will take you to our subscription page for our latest articles and to our website. Do follow me on LinkedIn if you want to keep up to date with the latest updates and insights. And we are now ready for the final Q&A. So there's a few questions that have come in, and I've got a few questions of my own. So I'll start off with a question that's come in here for Stephen particularly. So I'll ask Stephen, I've got a question for you. I've got a question for Alasdair and a question for yourself as well, Allan. If we take them turn by turn, starting with you, Stephen, you talked about local authorities getting involved, and some of these the integrations that you've had in terms of with GIS, etc. It sounds like really complex kind of projects, but could you expand? It's a very quick answer. How much involvement is required by a local authority? Because quite often that can be seen as that, well, we don't have the time, don't have the resources. So what is that involvement required, and how much involvement is required of local authorities to engage with some of these pilots, particularly the kind of the road sensing and the temperature sensing, and the Highland project you mentioned as well. So that's the first question to you, Stephen, and then I'll go on to Alasdair, a question for yourself.
I mean, the reason kind of the GIS software is really good is because every local authority will have a GIS expert, so they know how to handle the data sets, they know how to create new dashboards, layer on the data onto set alerts and everything. So there's that like native expertise already within the council. And we've also seen some of the local authorities are starting to build kind of data groups as well, which is really interesting, looking at kind of BI techniques. So they are starting to kind of build that and have that in-house, which is great, because as I say about that layering aspect of IoT, it's not just one use case, it's multiple, adding them together. That's when you start to create the real value. So the fact that they've got the in-house capability to take that data, modify it, and make that kind of tailored to what they're doing themselves is really powerful, and will give them huge value longer term from using the technology.
Thanks, Stephen. And Alasdair, for yourself, you spoke about the trial packs and the rollout of the network. I guess there's a generic question, because we do have non-Scottish local authorities in the call as well. So maybe a bit around what you're doing in the rest of the UK. Then also, you said there's 29 out of 32 local authorities. Which 3 are missing, if you can say that? What's needed to get them on board? And are any of your products and services available in the rest of the UK as well?
Yeah, so the obviously the accelerator packs formed part of the IoT Scotland project, so they've been part funded by North and Scottish Government, so we've been able to use that and obviously accelerate their take up within Scotland. Outside of Scotland, we already provide LoRaWAN networks. We've got LoRaWAN networks in various cities like York and Bradford. So we have a model that will allow us to design and build and operate a private network for a council. The benefit again within IoT Scotland is that there was some grant funding, so it was kind of like a build it and they will come. So we actually saw the foresight of the Scottish Government funding that. But equally, we have that skills and capability we can offer outside of Scotland. Unfortunately, there's no accelerator pack as such, but it's not that expensive a sort of jump to work with councils outside of Scotland to trial these various solutions. So yeah, we're very open to that. In terms of the councils that are not on board, I don't really want to name any as such, but obviously some of the areas that we've got aren't through councils; they'll be through housing associations. So the housing associations we work have got good coverage across several. We are going to continue to look to build this network out. We're at the sort of commercialization section of that, and we're working with some utility companies to make use of that network. And through those projects, we may continue to expand that network coverage. So watch this space. But I'm pretty pleased with the coverage that we've managed to achieve so far.
Great. Thank you. And Alan, there's a question here for you in terms of satellite. I think there's generic question around how does satellite support resilience and how capable is satellite in terms of managing multiple services. And I guess there's another kind of question just overlay on top of that. What's I think traditionally satellite has been thought of as being expensive. So can you dispel some of those myths?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Resiliency is actually a core part of our approach. We've taken a multi communications technology strategy to our business. So rather than building our services based on one satellite provider or one telecom provider, we're essentially agnostic on. So we've got an architecture which supports many different backhauls, and what that means is that our technology and service is very well tailored to essentially those mission critical use cases. So the use cases where whether it's an emergency services, for example, they need to get the data back. The data needs to come back, so they can't be the system itself can choose whether it sends data over satellite and can dynamically switch to cellular if it's available as well. And that kind of mission criticality is actually being a lot of industrial use cases are also kind of coming with the same requirement. We need this system to be ultra reliable, because if the data doesn't arrive back at our business intelligence platform, we're going to lose money, or there's a safety challenge there. So resiliency is a key part of the service, and I think it's a key consideration for use case development for anybody that's building an IoT use cases, to understand what happens if my primary network fails, what happens if this data doesn't arrive back, who's depending on the data, are we going to lose money as a health and safety issue? And then obviously from a cybersecurity aspect, the minister talked a lot about cybersecurity and how that's a big, how do we protect a user's data? That comes into resiliency as well. How do we make sure that the data, is secure all the way from sensor to, to the cloud or whichever data analysis service is theirs.
Great.
And then your second question, Iqbal, sorry, was that one that was on the different cost of satellites? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a generic kind of assumption satellite is expensive. In fact, there was on digital inclusion
Yeah, I mean,
yesterday.
That's it. Yeah, no, I mean, traditionally, satellite is expensive, but as I mentioned in the talk, the cost of data is coming down. It's being disrupted by these new low Earth orbit satellite constellations like SpaceX and OneWeb. Again, it's very use case dependent. So if you're dependent on the amount of data that you're sending, so if you're sending, low bandwidth data, for in certain circumstances, that's fine, and you can utilize it, but it doesn't scale. So you may be sending data on a kind of case by case basis, like paper message type thing. But then in other circumstances where you're sending a lot of data, you need a high bandwidth link, and that's more like a broadband link. And obviously that can be more expensive. So it is very dependent on the use case. The good thing is that there's lots of satellite services out there that can be tailored towards different use cases and are very cost efficient for the different use cases, much more cost effective than it used to be.
Great. Alasdair, there's a question for you, I think, that you may or may not have the answer to this, but so clearly IoT Scotland chose LoRaWAN as its kind of default network technology solution. So the question is, what other options were considered and how is LoRaWAN selected?
Good question in terms of, so I mentioned earlier that LoRaWAN is one of a number of sort of technologies out there. The reason for choosing LoRaWAN is quite a simple one. It's an open standard, so it's unlicensed, so anybody can put a gateway out and run that service. Obviously, we've done it in a joined up manner and provided a carrier class service at the back end of it and opened that up to the public sector and private sector. But equally, we do already provide solutions based on narrowband IoT and LTE-M that are coming through. So no IoT solution should probably just have one technology. You may mix and match the various technologies. So the reason for LoRaWAN is that's the right one for us to promote as a public network, but it's just one of a number that are available.
Great. Now, I'll keep this one open to whoever wants to come in. I've got my own response to this, but I'll keep that quiet just now. Do you think 5G is needed, or is existing 4G broadband coverage? Sorry, or is existing 4G coverage or existing broadband coverage sufficient? I'm guessing this is probably around some of the more kind of cellular type sensor-based applications. I think I know the answer to this, but who wants to take that?
Let me jump in, just a very quick one. So they're kind of different things. So my interpretation of LoRaWAN, for instance, on IoT is it's got battery-powered sensors. So you cannot deploy battery-powered 4G sensors and the batteries just won't last. The batteries on a LoRaWAN sensor will last 5 to 10 years. Our solution can use 4G as a backhaul from the gateway anyway. So it's just a different part of the jigsaw.
Interesting point. Okay, so there's a battery life, and I guess 5G depends on the use case. Again, if it's a very high bandwidth local implementation, then you could possibly even use a private 5G as opposed to a public 5G. And I think that's the big misunderstanding around 5G. Stephen or Alan, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, particularly for the kind of narrowband IoT and Cat-M standards, that's kind of going to be the main carriers of these type of applications we're talking about. 5G's got some applications, but because of high bandwidth, as Alasdair said, it tends to be more expensive module cost, higher power requirements. So a lot of it comes down to kind of what's the availability, what's the best choice based on availability. But if you're kind of deploying remote sensing, then you wouldn't normally go for that as your first choice. You'd look at the kind of more power efficient type technologies as your kind of primary choice for that.
Yeah, and again, I guess I would reiterate, we need to be careful not to be obsessed by the technology. So tell us the use case, what you're trying to achieve, then we'll worry about the technology last. So yeah, thanks for your questions. Keep them coming in. They're all good questions. So another question around, you have covered some really good IoT use cases for local government. Are there any use cases that central government is or should be looking at? That's a really interesting one. I've not thought about that myself. Who wants to take that one? Any thoughts on central government use cases for IoT?
I mean, again, jump in, central government, a lot of them have got buildings and properties. So a lot of these solutions are about monitoring those properties, whether it's energy usage on them, whether it's damp and mold, if it's MOD and housing for soldiers. So central government are just as relevant, I think, as public sector. Probably public sector have got more different slices of variety, but in terms of monitoring land or monitoring properties, then IoT is definitely an opportunity there.
And I guess
I would also add in there just to kind of critical national infrastructure is obviously an opportunity for us to utilise IoT in the monitoring of critical national infrastructure, and then using it across power networks and transport networks. We've seen some really interesting use cases where when the technology is deployed at scale is where you see the real value, and obviously to deploy at scale takes a lot of investment, so that would probably be a central government kind of activity. And I think the other thing I would probably say is that we talked about satellite and we talked about 5G and the various different. I think it's really this hybrid strategy in utilising the technology in a smart way, in an optimised way, to maximise the benefit that we get from all these different technologies. I totally agree with you, Iqbal, on that it's not a technology, but technology can enable the value that we get from these the use cases that are available.
Right, good. I know we're running slightly ahead over time here, but there's still quite a few attendees on board, so we'll take this last question and we'll call it a wrap unless some more questions come in. Alasdair, this one's directed to you. So how many and what type of sensors does the 15K accelerator pack include? I'm assuming that's from a Scottish local authority that wants to do a pilot.
Yeah, so the packs have different numbers of sensors. So we've set them up around about, I said, £15,000 worth with all the support behind it. So there are 75 intelligent lighting nodes. There are 50 waste management sensors, so waste. There are 40 building health, so CO2 sensors. There are 30 Legionella sensors. We're doing 15 properties for the social housing, so there's 15 properties that will have a survey on an MOT and 2 sensors per property. And then on the air quality, there are 15 external air quality sensors. On the road surface one, which we've just announced with CENSIS, there are 5 road surface sensors and 1 rain gauge, which allows them to see whether they have to do any gritting after they've already gritted.
On the road sensor use case, I think you said there were 5 sensors, is that right? How many roads or what length of a road would that cover typically? How would that be deployed?
So the reason there's 5 is, again, we're at the stage, so CENSIS are at a pre-production stage for this sensor, so we're going to ramp up that volume next year. So we're just helping them at the pre-production stage to evaluate these. So it's quite a small build level, so we've just selected 5. Typically, though, a council would put these on sort of routes where they have ice challenges or ice problems. And what it'll allow them to do is there will be relatively low cost. It will allow them to identify which part of the city or the area the ice is coming in from, the cold front is coming in from, and react accordingly. So 5 is not going to be enough for probably a typical fully blown solution, but we think it's good enough to benefit from the data that the sensors can provide. Okay,
brilliant. Well, with that, I think there's we're out of questions. We could probably go on and debate this another time for much longer, but that leaves me to close today. So thank you very much to Alasdair, Allan, Stephen for your contributions. Hopefully that was of real interest and provides some really great insights. And thank you for listening, feeding the questions. Really hope you took something away from this. And a very big thank you to those behind the scenes. So Audrey, Shan and Sarah for organising and promoting the event in a very short time scale. So a big thank you to all of you. And of course to Minister Stewart for his keynote at the beginning. And Feel free to connect with us all on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, and speak to you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.